Hello and welcome to Get a Better Handle on Life. I'm Barry Winbolt and this is my podcast. In each episode, I deliver expert insights, practical advice, and real-life examples to help you get a better handle on your life. Some of this comes from me and some from the inspiring people I'm in conversation with. And today, in this episode, I'm talking to Purdeep Sangha, author of The Complete Man, about the key issues facing men these days. I encourage you to listen to all of the episode, man or woman, especially if you want to understand the common pitfalls that both sexes can fall into in our understandings that Purdeep talks about later in the show. So, Purdeep, we're going to be talking about the 5 top things that are troubling men these days, and you're an expert in this. And I've got my own theories, and I sometimes feel I'm a bit a bit extreme, actually. But it's been refreshing to hear that you've researched this, you know about this. So can you introduce the topic, please? Welcome, yeah, sure. First of all. Thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Barry. I guess the topic itself is something that I'm passionate about, obviously being a guy myself. But where it really started was my dad. My dad struggled with alcoholism. He's a great dad when he was sober, but he struggled with alcoholism. He was an immigrant, then immigrated over to Canada, didn't really know the language very much, knew how to work hard, eventually built a successful business. And his whole life, he struggled with this inner fulfillment. And as a result, he went to alcohol, and he couldn't get past it, even though he tried. And so since I was a young boy, I've been studying, you can say, the psychology of men, but also in particularly how men and women are interacting or do interact. And things have changed significantly over the last 30 plus years in terms of relationships and how men are in relationships versus women, and what we are being told in society and the challenges that it's posing. Particularly right now, we're seeing a lot of men, especially even younger men, have a greater challenges in terms of mental health, their levels of self-confidence, direction. It's almost, and even to some level or degree, it's even this level of entitlement. Whereas when we grew up, it was a little bit different, right? We had to work hard. We had to go through the ringer to really get to where we are. And therefore, as a result, we had this inner, you can say, level of self-esteem or self-efficacy, you could say, or confidence. And we're not seeing that, especially in the younger generation these days. It's almost like this false arrogance. But there's a vast spectrum of challenges that each generation is facing. And I think that's what we'll talk about here today.
Well, you've mentioned lots of things that ring bells with me, but in particular, this notion of what I call self-agency, this belief that I can do things. Mm. And yes, I agree there's been a shift. And you also mentioned arrogance, which is probably, I think, when I've seen it, is a compensatory thing. It's not actually, it's to cover up that there is no real confidence. So I think, it's really fascinating what you're saying, to hear that, yeah, there's something going on here. For a moment, could you say something about what you mean by self-entitlement, please?
Well, I think this is what we're seeing both in men and women, is because it's almost like an instant gratification society these days. You can go on Amazon and get a package the next day, and sometimes even the same day. You can go online, and especially with younger men, this is one of the things that's been brought up a number of times, is their access to virtual women or pornography or whatever that looks like. So instant gratification from that perspective. So go online dating versus actually having to go out and put the time and effort in and see the rejection first in live hand. And it's easy to go and swipe on your phone to say whether you like someone or not. But all of these, I'm going to say, challenges that men generations ago had to face, the younger generation doesn't. They have different challenges. I'm not saying they don't have challenges. They have different challenges. But we used to have somewhat of a rite of passage, and we don't have that in society these days.
Right. Well, to take that specific thing about, because we often hear about, I wasn't like it in my day or our grandparents' day and all of that. Yes, of course. But let's put that in context for a minute, that something they were learning, you mentioned rejection, something they were learning was the basic skills of interpersonal relationships and dealing with that and building resilience in the face of rejection. It's hard enough. God knows, I know as a young man growing up, I was very bad at feeling confident around young women. But the result was that anybody who smiled at me, well, that was it. They were in if there was a chance. I wasn't selective, but neither was I very successful, as it happens.
Yes.
I mean, it's all worked out well in the end. But the point I'm trying to make is that if you've never learnt the hard knocks of life, if you've never been through them in your younger self, then you're not. That's going to translate into poorer resilience in the face of rejection, setback, and all sorts of other things. Because you've mentioned rites of passage. These are how we become men from boys, aren't they? And if we're deprived of those, we miss out.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right on there, Barry, because these are simple. Whether they're values or principles or life lessons like resilience or tenacity, whatever it might be, the methods can vary, and methods change and vary over the generations. Obviously, things were a little bit tougher 100 years ago and a few hundred years before that, and sometimes some of these rites of passages would be considered barbaric in today's age. But it's the key lessons that we need to learn as men that enable us to be functional. And I think that's the most important thing. And that's not being talked about. And I think, it goes beyond that. I think it's just, whether we've put a lot of our trust in the education system to raise our children. And I think that's starting to fail us. And for example, and I don't know what it's like in the UK, but in particular in North America, there's no real, you can say, education when it comes to financial management and relationship management at a young age, which are the two most important things you can think of from a life skill perspective. Now we have all of these confusions around gender and all this other stuff that's kind of, I'm going to say, noise. It's not that it's not necessarily important, but the basic life skills and functions, that's kind of, I feel like it's not being taught as well as it should have. But the reason why I say this is because we as parents need to take the responsibility and accountability for raising our children, because personally, I'm an advocate for the school system, and I think it's important, but I don't have trust in it like I used to, and I have to be very proactive now in terms of teaching my son to be a boy and my daughter to be a girl.
Yeah, very, very important. Yes, I think, I can echo what you're saying without insight now, because I don't have kids of school age anymore, but I've got 4 children and they've been through the system. They're now successful adults in their own right, but they didn't learn that at school. In fact, I would say in some cases, particularly the younger ones, they learnt it despite the school system, because actually it was working in the UK. It seemed to me as a parent, they were becoming very weak and woolly about managing certain aspects of behaviour in the school area. And that, for me, was lamentable, because some people need to be told, you're out of order, stop that. But of course, then they get flack from the parents who come down. So I hear they come to the school and they give So it's not an easy job being a teacher, but neither. We used to have something called in loco parentis, which was the school is the parent during the day. That's it. You hand your kids over and they take over your role till whenever the kids come home. It doesn't seem to exist anymore. It seems much more selective, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. And since this has been going on, 30 or more years, then presumably we've got a generation of men now who are becoming fathers who didn't actually, even before the current generation, didn't pick up quite the rules of boundaries, for example.
Yeah, I think a lot of kids these days, that's one of the things, it's funny you mentioned that, boundaries. I think that's one of the things that I'm saying personally, and not just the younger, I should say kids, but also men as well. There's not a very strong understanding of boundaries. And I think that obviously poses a lot of challenges, because what I'm seeing right now, in particular, if we talk about the challenges for men, is that I am seeing in a lot of cases, and this is more North America, that men are trying to do too much to please their spouse, and they're losing themselves, and they're not setting the boundaries because they are confused in terms of what it means to be a man in a relationship, what the expectations are, what the rules are. And again, every relationship is different. but it's almost like they've become pleasers now, and they are beating themselves up as a result. I'll give you a real practical example. A friend of mine, and he was in this relationship. He adored this woman, but she was, just because of a family dynamic, she was had lost a father, and she was very much attached to her brother. And there was almost like this conflict between her husband and her brother, because she was going to her brother as almost like the male figure, right? And he didn't know how to set those boundaries, because he didn't know if it was acceptable or not to set those boundaries. Whereas, I'm going to say...
Excuse me, when you say he, you mean the man in the relationship, not the brother, the man. So he didn't know... Husband. Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, the husband in the relationship did not know how to set the boundaries when it came to his wife's brother. And particularly, it wasn't necessarily the wife's brother's fault. It was, his ability to draw the boundaries with his wife and say, hey, look, that's not appropriate. Well, that accelerated over the years. And what ended up happening was he just lost his self-worth, because he didn't feel like he was the man in the relationship. And eventually he drank too much, and then it caught up with him, and he had to go to rehab. But this isn't a one-off. This is a very consistent pattern that I'm seeing in relationships, not necessarily the rehab, but a lot of men not drawing the boundaries and not knowing how to be the man in the relationship. And we're seeing more and more of that.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, because I've seen it happen. Because what should happen when people come together, of course, is they form a new family. And that's boundaried, isn't it? And our parental families become part of that unit, but they are peripheral to the central unit, which is us. And if you can't set those boundaries, you're in trouble. So
sorry, go ahead.
Well, what would you say to a man who is in the situation of your friend, who has this issue around boundaries? What would you say to somebody about, hey, it might be an idea to get a handle on this and to kind of think about this process of setting some boundaries with your female partner? Because she too has responsibility in that.
Oh, absolutely. So I think the first thing here is, first, as men, we need to educate ourselves. So educate ourselves, and whether it's picking up books or whatever it is, to educate ourselves in terms of what a healthy relationship has in terms of the attributes. And I think that's a few men actually do that.
Right.
So that is the first step, because unless we educate ourselves on what a healthy relationship looks like, it's hard to be confident in our decisions. And I even felt this challenge myself, because I had to draw hard lines, but I wasn't confident at first. I'm like, am I doing the right thing or am I not? Is this part of a healthy relationship or not? Because we typically see our relationship, you can say, model from our parents or other people around us, and typically they're not healthy, those relationships. So education is the first thing. And I always tell men too, there's a sense here of tapping into our natural feeling of who we are. And I think outside of the boundaries with the relationship, I think a lot of men aren't fully confident within themselves. So I always say, okay, educate yourself on relationships. Get yourself to a level where you are confident about yourself, regardless of whether you're in this relationship or not, that you know who you are, right? That old saying, know thyself. Because when you know thyself, it's almost like you naturally know what the boundaries should be now. Because now you're educated, now you know who you are. It gives you that confidence to be able to say, hey, look, this type of behavior, I don't think it's, these are the terms that I get men to use. It's not necessarily good or bad. It's more healthy or unhealthy. So from the perspective of the man, if he feels like it's unhealthy for the relationship or unhealthy for himself, and then he needs to voice that. And so what are the behaviors, and what is the ask in terms of the change in behaviors and the reasons behind that? And that's kind of like I'm just going to say the high level approach that I would suggest, but it really comes down to understanding what healthy relationships are, but more importantly, getting to know thyself. That's the bigger journey, I would say, because it takes, a lot of men have not developed themselves fully yet, and they are still challenged with that. And as a result, they can't have those difficult conversations. So those are the steps I would suggest.
You're listening to Get a Better Handle on Life. I'm Barry Winbolt, and in this episode, my guest is Purdeep Sangha, author of The Complete Man, and we're discussing the 5 top challenges facing men today. Purdeep Sangha, you spoke about being self-aware enough to have those difficult conversations, talking from the men's perspective. As originally I was a family therapist, I was had as a conversation between two people because it's no good having your head clear. One of the problems in relationships is that frequently people mature at different rates. Okay, so you get married when you're 20 or 25 or 30. By the time you're 40, you're two completely different people. And you've either stayed in tandem with your value systems and you can talk about these things and these kind of hotspots in your relationship, or you can't. And if you've got somebody who absolutely can't because they don't accept it, then of course it's a pretty tough call. But at least if you're intact yourself as a developing male in this case, you are then able to withstand that and make decisions based on a reference point, would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. Because here's the one thing, and this is what I've seen change for men, not just in the relationship with their spouse or just, it could be family members, it could be parents, it could be their business relationship with the business partners, is when a man becomes fully confident and has a good understanding of who he is. And now we're kind of getting in the philosophical and spiritual realm too, but at the spiritual level, at the soul level of who he is and why he's been put on this earth, then it's okay. I've seen men be like, okay, if this isn't working out for you, right? If we've had these tough conversations and it's not working out for you in terms of their spouse, they have this conversation with their wife, it's okay. It's okay if we move apart. It's okay if we separate, because I will be okay, because I know this is what is healthy for me. And then that fear is still there, but it's not as great. The number one reason that we see, and then this is just from our studies in terms of, there's a difference, I think, and we were talking about this off air, a lot of men need to have better relationship skills. Okay, but let's just put that aside and assume that they are. Let's just say they have a decent amount of relationship skills. They've been communicating effectively, and there's some kind of breakdown or whatever that is. But a lot of men will continue to deal with the behavior because they don't want to lose, A, access to their kids, B, they don't want to lose their wealth and everything that they've worked so hard to establish. So they'll either stay in the relationship unhappy, or they'll do some other types of behaviors which are not very healthy at all. And so when men are comfortable with themselves to be able to walk away, it's kind of a win-win for everybody, because then you don't have those unhealthy behaviors as a result. And I think that's what ends up happening. I see a lot of men, when they get frustrated to the point where they're fearful and they aren't able to walk away, they start to do some real dumb things.
Okay. Like bad behaviors like drinking, maybe drugs and
substance abuse, infidelity, gambling, taking on other risks, spending all of their time at work intentionally.
Okay.
These types of behaviors.
Yeah, I've seen it all. And just to rewind a bit, I'm listening to you and I'm thinking, I've got this devil's advocate on my shoulder and thinking, yeah, but how do you've got to be, I think two things. I think one thing, you've got to have a sort of a growth mindset about yourself. You've got to think, okay, things aren't going right. What can I do? What can I learn? What do I need to do? Instead of, oh, it's all the other person. Now, that's a very common scenario, but it starts with curiosity about oneself. It starts with, you've mentioned the spiritual realm and the soul, and of course we have an inner life. I know people have trouble with this word spiritual, especially men, but you're wrong, men. If you're listening to this, this is what you are. This is what, at the end of the day, you'll be judged on. It's not, and I don't mean in the religious sense necessarily, although that might be your belief, but, it's how we conduct ourselves, and that's based on our values and our beliefs about ourselves, isn't it?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
So I think curiosity about oneself is a fundamental here, but in order to be curious, you've got to think about yourself. Well, maybe there's another way. Maybe this isn't. Maybe the way my dad did it, or maybe the way I saw my parents interact isn't the only way. How can I make me better? Is that kind of a shorthand?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Because that inner growth is the most important thing. And even science has shown this now. Neuroscientists are now saying that our external environment is a direct reflection of our internal state now. So the way our life, the way our relationships, our life, our job, everything is a direct reflection of our own internal biological state. Now, that's pretty impressive for scientists to say this now. So if that is the case, then what do we need to change internally to be able to change the external world? And that's why I wrote the book, The Complete Man, is because of that very reason. A lot of men were focused, are and still are, on the external world, and they want to change something externally without realizing that perhaps if they try to change something externally and they're still behaving the same way, that environment is going to be recreated.
Yeah.
And so it goes back to what you were saying, absolutely, Barry, is once we focus on ourselves and change the internal environment, then our external environment starts to shift, including relationships.
Yeah, and I have to say, it never ends. I'm grateful to hear that, because, even though I know it and I've read all the books and I still dip into them, I just need to hear this stuff now and again when I'm having a bad day, focus on myself. Okay, just do what you do well and this sort of thing. One of the things that occurs to me as I'm hearing the word external environment and thinking about cases I've seen among people in the sort of younger age group that we're talking about, is that where do we turn to when we're feeling uncertain, when we're feeling lost, when we're getting into difficulty with a relationship? We turn to, of course, social media, which we know isn't reliable, but forget that for a minute. We want to feel supported. We want to feel understood. We turn to our peers and we want to hear stories that support our own dysfunction. So, yeah, man, they're all like that. My wife was the same kind of story. And, okay, that makes me okay then. Instead of thinking, well, whatever happened in your life, my relationship was completely unique to the two people in it. So we cannot generalize like that. And we can't find solace in our entourage that says, you're okay, she's wrong, or you're okay, he's wrong. But unfortunately, that is what's available. That's where we normally go, isn't it?
Yeah, you know what? I think that's been happening in society for such a long time, is because we tend to flock together, right? The similar mindsets and beliefs tend to flock together, and that's how people have the feeling of comfort. Because if anybody challenges us or challenges our belief system, then it's uncomfortable. And in those challenging times, whether it's in a relationship or other situation, we want to feel comforted, rather than uncomfortable. And so that's just how we behave. But I completely agree with you. That's why I would say I've been blessed, because I've had friends, mature men, and predominantly older than myself. I've always hung around with older men because I've found their wisdom to be very enlightening, and I'm always learning from them. But they've always been constructive. So if we have a problem, it's not necessarily, you know what, my wife's like that too, or whatever it is. It's more around, have you tried this? Yeah. Have you tried that? Is there a different way of communicating effectively? So these are the conversations. Having constructive conversations are important. Going back to what you were saying, it's not just a pity fest, right?
Right. Well, and the other thing, of course, what you're illustrating is that in order to hear those, in this case, older men, but in order to hear those comments about what if there was another way? What if you tried this? What if you tried that? These are all questions very familiar to me in my work. But of course, in order to apply those questions to yourself, if you're stuck in a place where things aren't going too well, you actually have to, as Gregory Bates and numerous others have said, you have to step up to another logical level. You have to go to a different place in your mind to be able to entertain the possibility of those questions being valid. If you ask yourself those questions from your stuckness, then you're going to come up with answers. Yeah, I tried that. Or, no, it wouldn't work. So you have to be able to, what I call, transcend that level of being stuck in the problem to actually start to breathe a breath of fresh air and think, well, what if? And if you find the right mentors, and I guess that's where somebody like you comes in with your work, then you've got somebody you listen to, somebody you respect, and somebody who can perhaps nudge you into a place where you can hear these, I guess you call them wisdoms.
Yeah, obviously the individual, and you're an expert in this area, obviously, with your background experiences, a person needs to be ready to be able to hear any kind of insight for them to be able to change their life. And so whether it's funny, from a spiritual perspective, we say they have to be at a certain frequency to be able to hear something. So if they're in a frequency of fear or anger or whatever it is, they're not going to hear necessarily something that's about peace or joy. And we see that quite often. But it comes also down to core beliefs and mindsets, as you talked about, having a growth mindset, more of a learning mindset. I think that's one of the most important things for any man to have, or any human being to have, is to have the mindset of a learner and continuous growth, because then we can take a look at challenge and say, how do I grow and expand as a result of this? I think that's one of the things for me that I've taken internally myself, and this is something that was taught to me by my grandfather because of our religious faith. I'm not a very religious person by any means, but I grew up in a house of faith, which is Sikhism, right? So Sikhs, and the word Sikh or Sikhi means to be a disciple of, to be a learner, and that's what my grandfather taught me at a very young age. I was a young boy, and so everything about my life has been about learning. That's what it's been about. And I think as a result of that, I've been able to take these challenges and like these situations and say, what can I learn and grow as a result of that? It's not just about getting better. It's about being open to, going back to what you're saying, and having that curiosity.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely echo that. That's bang on. You mentioned being in the right frequency, logical level, same thing, different language. But it's this old thing about, I once heard a wise old man say to me, it's not about leading a horse to water, it's about making them thirsty. And we're talking about when the individual becomes thirsty for that knowledge or that understanding, or even open to the possibility, and that's the thirst. Maybe there's another way, maybe there's something I could learn here. And I hope I've very neatly brought it back to our theme for this conversation, which is, what are the 5 top things? What are the challenges that men are facing, in your view? What are a couple of the things that, what would be a good starting point to sort of overcome some of these challenges? So what are the top 5, do you think?
Well, I would say one of the ones is the lack of mentorship. And this is something that used to happen, and it's still happening somewhat, but I don't think that men these days have mentors from the perspective of healthy mentors, because it's easy to go on social media and see an influencer, someone who's of authority, and I can tell you a lot of these individuals do not have the backing, right? Or they have one persona, one facet of their life, but the rest of their life is falling apart. So having the mentors and having the right mentors I think is very, very important. That's one of the challenges, is we're not mentoring younger men as well as we could, and we're not getting mentored. We're not looking out for mentors. We're discounting our elders and the wisdom that they have. So we know that the extended family unit has degraded, and that's one of the biggest challenges.
And also the workplace doesn't exist. Typical male traditional jobs, good or bad, mining, shipbuilding, forestry, whatever men did throughout millennia, they were around other men who'd keep them in line and show them how to be men. Good, bad, and indifferent. But there would be a social aspect to that, and that's gone.
Yes, and so that's part of the other challenge as well. So if we talk about the next challenge, is we know that there are, particularly in North America, we're seeing this, that there are men out there who are just not behaving very well. And as a result of that, and I shouldn't say as a result of that, one of the challenges is that other men are not challenging them effectively because they're afraid of getting ousted. It's so easy to now be torn down on social media and your reputation taken like that. So there's a lot of men, this is the other big challenge, there's a lot of men that are feeling silenced, or they don't feel like they can step up and say things because they know it could, their careers, right, the reputation can be ended overnight. And so that is another big challenge that we're seeing in the world of men these days. And it's causing frustrations. There's a lot of men that are seeing other men behave a certain way, but they can't challenge them. They don't want to say anything. And the American political system is a prime example of that, right? We know what's happening there. It's kind of it's it's going to be a case study for the next few decades, I'm sure, that's going to come out in history. But that's another big aspect. The other thing is masculinity is being attacked and has been attacked for the last 10 to 20 years. And we are openly seeing now.
Can I make that 30 years?
Yeah, 30 years. Yeah.
I saw it happen in the 70s, so that's almost 50 years. And it became extremely difficult to be any form of traditional male. And I'm not holding up any dodgy values or anything, but it was the post-60s and the hippies and then the feminist movement, there was a lot of confusion going on there in men and women.
Yes, and that is absolutely true. So the feminist movement obviously caused a lot of that, and some of that had to happen, but it has accelerated and escalated dramatically at this point where there are men, they're especially in younger campuses these days, if you talk to younger men, they don't know what to, they're afraid. They don't know what they should say, shouldn't say to a woman, how they should approach women. Like it's just, and even in the corporate world, which is, I'm going to say danger as well. To be a middle-aged white man these days, it's almost like you got a target on your back because you're apparently there because you're middle-aged white men have been favored, not because of your skill set or whatever that is.
Yeah, well, because we're a product of I'm not middle-aged anymore. We're a product of the patriarchy. We're just perpetuating the traditions, in inverted commas, that got us to the practices that got us to this terrible state in the world. I get that. I hear that.
And so men who have legitimately worked hard, for example, to get to their positions, who might be middle-aged white men, are afraid. They're afraid of losing their jobs because of, not that there's anything wrong with diversity, equity, and inclusion. That needs to happen. But the ways it's happening and how we've targeted certain places, I'm hearing in particular, even in India, this is happening where men are being forced to leave their roles in senior positions to open them up for women because there's a political agenda behind that. And there's a lot of resentment that's being built up behind that part. So there's that part. And then there's the lack of fulfillment, which is really, really interesting because I don't think, particularly in North America, we have a society, if you have a decent job, right? We have a society where you have access to pretty much everything. And we have more toys and, nicer houses and you can name it. Compared to 100 years ago, but we don't have that same level of fulfillment for men, right? Men will have everything and feel like they have nothing. And it's because they don't know what brings them fulfillment. And I'll give you a personal example, whether it's my dad or my grandfather or me, growing up in an orchard, that's how we grew up. That was our family business as well. And the joy and fulfillment that we got was from watching the crops grow. That was the fulfillment. That was the joy. The hard work, the blood, the sweat, the tears that we put into the crop was what created the fulfillment. When we would see a great crop, it was like, wow, we did that, right? That was where the fulfillment came from. Not from the cars, not from the houses, not from the other things, but from the work that we put in. And that, if we talk about agency, if we talk about, this concept of flow, for example, and it all comes down to, are we working towards fulfillment, or are we actually getting fulfillment along the way? And that is the difference I see in men these days, is that they're trying to work towards fulfillment and they're never attaining it or achieving it, rather than being fulfilled with what they're actually doing. And I think that is a huge challenge.
Yeah, one of the examples I often use is, 100 pre-industrially, certainly, and 100 or so years ago, you'd go to work in the morning and there'd be a pile of something over here, and by the evening it'd be over here. Or that stack of wood would be a bunch of widgets. You saw a product, and it was through your hands and through your labours that you produced that. There was tangible proof that you exist. Now, you just don't get that from being in real estate or from being, it's completely shot, that sort of normally accessible growth and fulfillment process that any human being needs to go through. And it's not enough to put that effort into people, because it won't happen. Your kids might let you down, or your partner might leave you. If your identity is so strongly linked to something around you that can move and shift, you're in a bad place. But if it's an apple tree or a field or a house you're building, or even, your hobby, you might have built a car even, but you've used manual labor and your skill and your understanding and your patience and all of that stuff. It's a tremendous metaphor for life, isn't it?
Absolutely. And knowing that it could be done again. And that's the other thing, right? It's not the end result. It's whether it's a trade or the skill or the knowledge, the effort, right? That if something does burn down, I can rebuild it. That's okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. And so the last thing I would say, Barry, in terms of what's challenging men, is this how men and women have been are now in this almost like this fight, this opposite position rather than working together. So we are in this match now, particularly in North America, in terms of who's better, right? And where's the equity? And men, women don't need men, and men are backlashing against women. And this whole thing is completely unhealthy.
Yeah.
And this is so it's this corporate. It's in the corporate world, but it's also in the home world, the relationship world now, where men don't understand their role in the relationship. And so their significant other is saying, hey, look, I'm making money here. And, and this is very common. And there's nothing wrong with this if the couple actually gets along and agrees to this. But, I want to focus on my career, and I want you to stay at home and take care of the kids. Well, if the guy is okay with that, that's fine. But here is some of the challenges that we know, because my background's also in neuroscience, right? So we know that, for example, that when men are the main caregivers of children, when they're, let's just say at a young age, their testosterone drops by up to 40%.
Wow.
That's huge. What does that mean? That means for men, the very hormone that makes a man, pretty much a man, drops by 40%. There's nothing wrong with that if it's temporary. But if you do this over a number of years, that man's masculinity drops. His sex drive drops, right? There's other things that happen as a result of that as well, biologically. Mood changes, for example. Doesn't have the same amount of motivation and drive. So these are the things that make men, and we don't necessarily realize them. But we're seeing this imbalance in energy now, where men they don't have the same level of, let's just say, masculine energy that women are looking for. And women have more masculine energy, and men are seeking the feminine energy, and they're not getting that. And it can become very, very frustrating, for both parties, when that energy, if we're talking about energy, is not available in their partner. So when a man is looking for that feminine energy and he's not able to get it from his woman, then it either turns into two things. He needs to get it from somewhere else, or it's almost like he keeps that energy internal and starts to eat away at him. And the same thing for women. Women are becoming, it's challenging. So let's just say part of the masculine energy is to take lead and be the protector. Well, when women have that role, they're not naturally in their feminine, and they actually start to get autoimmune diseases as a result of that. And so we're seeing these changes biologically, both in men and women, that are impacting relationships. So healthy people, men and women, are becoming unhealthy because of this change in energy.
And longer term, society becomes unhealthier, and we know the birth rate's dropping and all of those knock-on effects of this happening. And other social problems like more people choosing to live alone, housing, it has tremendous far-reaching effects potentially. And what we're talking about here, because I'm conscious of the fact that, the devil's advocate again might be saying, oh yeah, this is all about manpower and all that sort of stuff. But I know it's not. But I wouldn't want anybody to hear that. How do you respond to critics who say, well, men have done a load of bad stuff. It's not all about men, blah, 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 whatever it is. The difficulty with this conversation in society, it seems to me, about men, women, race, any sector of the community, it becomes polarized very quickly. And people need to stand back and say, hang on a minute. We have evolved over millennia, and these traditional roles, like them or not, are what have got us to the point where we are on the planet. And sure, there have been shifts in culture, social changes, and all of those things. But this shouldn't be divisive. This should funnel people together in some ways so that we start to hear each other. So what's the next step in your broader message? Because you've got the complete man, I get that, and you're not going to write the complete woman. And God knows there are enough books written by women about emotions for men and women, by the way. I used to, when I was doing my research earlier, and when I was lecturing, I'd say to people, have you noticed that all the books I've quoted are written by women about relationships? There isn't one that I could find at the time, I'm talking a good few years ago, written by men or a man. And of course the response would be, which I share in the joke, it'd be a very thin book, wouldn't it? Men don't have emotions. But actually, it has been neglected. It's been seriously neglected by men and by women to understand our inner workings. We've been told for so long, listen to others, understand their feelings, da-da-da-da-da. But men's feelings are not heard because society doesn't know how to listen to them, is my pitch on that.
Yeah.
And men have a responsibility here because we don't know how to express them very often either, because our behaviour shows something that doesn't look like an emotional response. It might be that we just shut up and stop talking. And John Gottman's research has shown this is exactly what we do when we feel powerless, when we think it's going no further. And so there's a lot of mileage in that. And I've taken it off track very slightly. But what's the message so that this doesn't sound divisive? We want to support men. We want men to be more informed. What's the uniting message in this?
Well, I think the uniting message here is that, yes, men and women, if we take a look at any healthy family unit, it requires both parties to make that family unit healthy. And so I'm a firm believer that when we have healthy relationships between men and women, whether it's at home or the workplace, we will have a healthier society. We know that. So here's the thing, and we're starting to see a shift in this, Barry, is that about 10 years ago, there was a lot of pushback in terms of this conversation that I was having. Things have changed significantly now. In fact, some of our biggest advocates for my book are women. I was just at a women's event of 50 top senior executive leaders who are women who wanted a copy of my book, which wouldn't have happened 6 years ago. Yeah. So now even women are understanding, wow, it's not necessarily that they don't need men. We just need to understand each other. So what is the message? I think this message is that we need to work together. I think men understand this. I think from a woman's perspective, if we're talking about pushback, is if you take a look at when a man is mindful in his own right, when I mean he understands himself and has, let's just say, a decent emotional intelligence and awareness and can communicate effectively. If you ask a man what one of his biggest purposes in life is, just ask the question. And I'm going to give you a little bit of hint. For most men, they will say, it's to provide a better life for my partner and my children.
All right.
That is their number one purpose. And so men already understand this. If women understand that and they're like, wow, like everything that my husband does, regardless of how crazy it may seem, or, unorthodox or whatever it might, or the challenges that we have, he's doing it for me. I can now understand that. Maybe I can get behind some of this. So instead of pinning us against each other, I think if we understand the motives behind this, each other, and our true nature, we'll get there. I'm very hopeful, Barry, because even in the last 2 years, I've seen more accelerated conversations where women are saying, we need more conversations for men around this. We've beat up men for too long already, and it's not doing us women any good. So on both sides, I think we need to just come to the table and have these conversations and have a true understanding.
Well, and your work obviously is an important factor in the arena you work in, and people like you putting this message out there. And I'm really glad to hear those. I'll make those the final words because I think that's a very strong message. And it chimes perfectly with what I understand about communication and all of the work that I've done for all the years and continue to do. And yeah, let's keep people talking. That's why I do the podcast. I prod people, and I'm sure it's what you do in your work. And I'm really grateful for the time. It's always hard ending these conversations because there's so much more I'd like to talk about. But I hope it's been as enlightening for the listener as it has for me. So Purdeep Sangha, I'd just like to say thank you so much. Your book is called The Complete Man. It's out now and available from all the usual sources. I've checked on that. And I'll put a link to your website in the description of this podcast episode.
Thank you, Barry. This was a very, I'm going to say, engaging and mindful conversation. I've thoroughly enjoyed speaking to you.
Thank you very much. All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Well, what a pleasure, a genuine pleasure it was speaking to Purdeep, and I bow before his extensive knowledge of his subject. I really encourage you to check out his book, The Complete Man, details in the episode notes, and you can also find more about him at Purdeep Sangha, that's Sangha, purdeepsangha.com. I hope you found today's episode informative. I certainly did. And above all, I hope you find it useful. Please, if you did, leave a comment, share, or even subscribe so you don't miss an episode. You can also find me on LinkedIn, on my website, barrywimbolt.com, and now on YouTube. Details are in the episode notes. And remember, we're all on a journey, and it's never too late to get a better handle on life. Thanks for listening. Until next time, this is me, Barry Winbolt, saying goodbye for now.